Que la famille. Que la famille.
Hi everyone, thank you for being here. My name is Yunus, I'm the CFO at The Family. I'm super happy to have all of you here joining us, and I'm especially happy to have Hiroki here with us today. I'll introduce him very, very quickly afterwards, but just a few elements about this session. So we're going to talk about culture and organization. It's a super important topic for early stage founders, for first time founders, or actually for anyone who actually wants to build a company that scales up. It's a really, really important topic. So for those of you who do not know who Hiroki is, he's the co-founder and CEO of this amazing company, GoCardless, specializing in collecting recurring payments and making things easy for you to keep track of. He'll tell us a little bit more about it in a second. But just before we start and before we chat together, at the end of the session, there will be a Q&A. So please ask a lot of questions in the comments, and we'll select the best questions and talk about them. So Hiroki, welcome. Thanks for joining us. We're thrilled to have you here today. My first.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, pleasure. My first question would be for you to tell us a little bit more about GoCardless with your own words, what you do, and perhaps where you are at the moment, how the company grew.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So at GoCardless, we're a payments business focused on building a new and better way to move money around online by building technology on top of the banking rails. And we've been around for a while now. So we started the business just over 10 years ago in 2011, and have focused over the last 10 years on really cracking the recurring payment space. That's kind of the first market that we've entered. And we work with a really wide variety of different types of businesses. We have about 70,000 businesses collecting payments through the platform every month, processing over $25 billion a year now in volume for them. And very, very much kind of focused on these kind of use cases where you've got this ongoing relationship between the customer and the business. So ranging from small early stage companies or startups, small mum and pop kind of shops, all the way through to much larger brands that you probably would have all heard of and use on a day-to-day basis. So that's kind of where we are today, but it still feels like we're kind of early in our life. It's 10 years in, but the next decade I'm much more excited about than the first one. I think that there's a big opportunity for us to continue building the business. So I like to, even though we're not really a startup anymore, I like to think that we're a startup. So
okay, so I'll take you back to when you actually were a small startup.
A long time ago. I have to see if I remember.
A long time ago, and perhaps start by asking. So the topic here today is culture. Two-tiered question. First part of the question would be culture. How is it important? Why do you believe it's important to talk about culture when you're building a startup, or to think about culture at all when you're building a startup? And second, what were the first kind of like bricks of culture that you laid when you started at GoCardless?
Well, I mean, for me, culture has always been an incredibly important part of building the company, right? One of the main reasons we wanted to start a business in the first place was that we wanted to build something that we'd be really proud of, right? And something that we'd be really excited to work on and work in. I kind of think of building a company as kind of like a journey, right? Has lots of different stages, has challenges, it has highlights, it has lowlights. But one of the most important things about what makes the journey enjoyable is the people that you're with, right? The people you're on the journey with. And so that was always really clear to us, that we wanted to build a company where we felt excited to work because of the people that we're working with. And so, that was very obvious early on. But to be honest, when we first started the business, whilst we were very clear in our minds that that was something that we cared a lot about, we didn't really know how to go about building a culture, and we didn't actually build our culture explicitly. It wasn't like we were there sort of saying, okay, this is how we want our culture to be, and we're going to be very defined about it and structured. It was much more driven in the early stages by being very focused on finding people that we thought would be really great at the jobs that we were asking them to do, but also would be people that we were really excited to work with and that we thought would be a great kind of addition to our culture. And so I think probably the most important thing in the early stages is valuing culture and caring about it, and not just hiring someone because you're in a rush, not just hiring someone because you think they'd be great at the job, but also caring about some of the stuff around. Okay, well, how will they add to the dynamic of the team? What will they be like to work with? Are we excited to work with them, etc., etc.?
I understand. And so, was there a moment when it shifted from, because from what I understand, it was a little bit implicit at first, but was there a moment when it became explicit, that you started learning about it? And if so, like, what did you do to actually master that topic? Like, what was your process?
So for us, I don't think there was like a single moment in time where we went, okay, we've gone from like implicit to explicit, right?
Okay.
What I think we found was that there was a few things that happened that I noticed as the company started scaling. So the first thing was, obviously, as you start to grow, you can't be involved in every single hiring decision, right? And in order to enable a company to really scale, you need to empower others around the organization to hire people, right? And then the question becomes, okay, well, what is it? What used to be like a gut feel, do we think this person's a good person to join the company or not, needs to start to be defined, right? Because you can't ask the rest of the organization to just say, oh, well, do you think I'd like this person, or do you think that I would want to hire this person? Like, you need to have some actual concrete direction. And it was quite interesting because for us, what that ended up turning into was trying to articulate our values, right? And this is something that we didn't do initially. We were probably maybe 30 people when we first tried to do it, and actually it took us 3 attempts to try and to define our values before we ended up with a set that actually stuck. And that's probably a whole nother conversation. We can get into that in a moment. But I think that that was definitely one area. So I guess driven by that need to say, okay, well, we want to enable people to hire people in the organization without the whole team having to meet the person. And in order to do that, we need to start becoming a bit more concrete and defined in what are we actually looking for when we say that someone needs to be a culture fit. And then I think the second thing that we found was that whilst we were being sort of undefined in that, it started to kind of turn into not, is this person a good culture fit, and more, do I like this person, right? And that's quite dangerous, because you end up kind of optimizing for the wrong things, right? And the way in which we noticed, at least, it kind of manifests the most was that you ended up hiring a very, very undiverse team, right? Everyone kind of had the same background, right? And so we ended up with a lot of young guys that went to the same universities, had done similar jobs, thought in the same kind of way, and we realized that, okay, that like we're too sort of group. There's too much groupthink, right? Like we want there to be more diversity in the organization, and the way in which we initially been sort of trying to hire based on, do we think that this person's a good culture fit, in an implicit way, was turning into a lack of diversity. And I think one of the things that we have thought a lot about as we scale is, how do you kind of evolve your culture whilst also trying to drive the diversity of the organization, right? And in some senses, those two things, they're not opposing, but almost by definition, if you're getting more and more diverse people into the organization, you're going to be changing the culture, right? Because you're bringing in different points of view, different perspectives, different experiences, different ways of thinking, and that's all really great, right? So it's like, how do you make sure that as the culture evolves, it's evolving in a way that you feel excited about and you think is positive?
That's a great thing to mention, because so just going back a little bit, you said it all started from a business need, hiring the right people, not only people that were lookalikes, but bring in some diversity. Did you have to work backwards on the value or on the values, or was it almost at the same time that you figured, okay, perhaps that's the moment that we need to define our values, and then within this process of defining the values, what was your role as a leader, as a founder, opposed to what the team had to bring forward?
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of the first bit about, what was it that kind of led to the lack of diversity? I think that, I mean, we realized that actually after we put the values in place. So it wasn't, the values on their own did not solve the kind of diversity challenge. I think it was being explicit about it, like alongside starting to define more concretely, okay, what do we mean when we say we want someone to be a good culture fit? I think it was also about being more explicit about what it wasn't, right? Which is not, it was not, we're hiring people that look like us and think like us and that we would want to spend time in the pub with. We're trying to hire people that are actually like, we feel are strong on a set of values that we've defined very clearly, but then embracing the fact that maybe they are very different people to us, and having the confidence to think, okay, but as long as they do actually, as long as they do adhere to those values and live up to those values, then the other things can change, and we can be confident that the culture will still be moving in a positive direction. In terms of like setting the values themselves, it was a really interesting experience for me, because in many ways it kind of, the different attempts, I said, like, it took me 3 attempts to make it work within the organization, and in many ways they reflect in some senses my journey in terms of leadership, right? And so when we first tried to set our values, we were about 30 people, something like that, and at that point in time, we were all still, it was still small enough that we were all almost like a set of peers, right? There wasn't really any kind of structure. There was no like managers really. There was no like even real proper role definitions, and it was kind of just a band of people working together as friends almost, right? And as a leadership style, I felt very felt very uncomfortable as a leader, right? I didn't feel like, I wasn't someone that felt comfortable sort of saying, okay, this is where we're going to go. I was very much consensus driven. I really wanted to kind of get everyone bought in and get people's perspectives, etc. And I think that's some really important qualities, but I was very, very much on that side of the spectrum. And so the first time we tried to set the values, we did it in a very, very collaborative way, right? We basically said, okay, as a company of 30 people, we're going to come up with these values together, and we're going to define them together. And it took a very long time, for one, doing it with 30 people. But what ended up happening was that we ended up with something that like no one disagreed with, right? But no one was really excited about them either, right? It was almost like, and anything that like someone suggested that they were excited about would get cancelled out by all the other people that weren't excited about it. And so you end up with this kind of watered down set of values where it was sort of like they didn't offend anyone, but no one was super passionate about them. And in particular, I wasn't particularly passionate about them, right? And so it made it really difficult to sort of shout about them and talk about them. And it was almost like we felt not embarrassed about them, but they were just sort of like, they ended up sort of, gathering dust in the corner almost, right?
If you don't mind me interrupting,
No.
what made them watered down? Like, how would you define this is a good value. Is it something you're excited about? That's what you were talking about?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, concretely, I wasn't excited about them, right?
Okay.
And I don't think anyone in the organization was excited about them enough to really push them, right? And sort of shout about them from the rooftops. And so, and this is something that, we tried a second time. We did it somewhat similarly. Again, it ended up with a similar kind of situation where no one really cared about them. And it was actually only the third time I was working with a coach, and he was pushed me a lot because he was trying to help me to kind of think about my role as a leader, right? And the way he would articulated it was like that kind of transformation from becoming a founder to being a CEO, right? And they're different, right? I mean, I'm still a founder, that's super important, but I'm also a CEO, and that is a different role, especially as the company scales. And embracing that, and getting a bit more comfortable in saying, okay, well, look, like actually, it matters how much I care about these values as it personally, and and so when we ended up doing it a very different way the third time, and I actually ended up starting with my own values. I thought about it for a while and wrote like almost like an essay on, okay, this is what I care about as a person. These are what I think my values are. Not like super articulated, but the kind of ideas, right? And then I picked like a handful of people from across the organization that I felt really embodied the values and the culture of the organization. I said, right, I want you as the, I think it was 5-6 people at the time. I want to work with you to define these values. And we worked on it together, and we ended up with a set of values that in a very small group we were super excited about, right? And when I picked like a handful of people, it wasn't like I picked the sort of all the senior people. I picked people from across the organization, some of the most junior members of the team, some of the most senior members of the team, and but people that I felt were really, really embodied the values. And then when we ended up coming up with those, it was interesting because I don't think we would have come up with those if we'd have gone to the whole organization, right? And they weren't the same values as my personal values. They evolved, right? But they were values that we were all super excited about. And when we did that, we were able to really make them stick, because what was really important was that like I felt happy to shout about them, and I would talk about them a lot, and then other people would start to get more passionate about it, and then they would talk about it a lot, and it was in that kind of process that we found something that really felt like it was that really resonated. And since we have had those values, like literally we've made one tweak to one of the values. It wasn't even changing it entirely, it was kind of a tweak, and that's it. They're still the same values that we live by today. And I think that we've actually done a great job of embedding them into the organization, and really living by them. So that's something that has been a really important part of the journey for our culture.
That's super interesting, because it sounds like once you've done that job, and it's a whole process that you have to get right, but you can get wrong very easily about, and then go back to and have to retweak several times. Once you have that, does it get easier to hire, or does it get harder and harder as the organization scales?
In terms of hiring while sticking to your values?
Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. It's something that I think about all the time. I wonder, like we've hired a lot of people recently, right? I think we've probably hired 400 people in the last 18 months. And so and I haven't met all of them, right? So it's something that I think about a lot. I think what we focus on a lot though is, and I think what's a really important factor in it is how the organization behaves, right? Because there's two levels to values, right? One is how does every individual behave, right? Which is super important, and that's the majority of what defines the culture. But I think there's key moments where the organization makes decisions, right? As a team, you come to a decision on something, and the way that you respond and the way you decide in those can have quite an outsized impact, I think, on the way that the organization really embraces or doesn't embrace the values, right? To what extent are they real, right? Because what I think is very toxic is when if everyone sees that actually the decisions the business is making is not sort of actually sort of living the values that you say that you're living, then all of a sudden they lose all meaning, right? That they lose credibility. And so that could be anything from like, okay, there's been, I'll tell you a really concrete example, right?
Sure.
This was a few years ago. We had someone come in and steal a bunch of things from our office, right? We had a burglary,
Okay.
and a bunch of laptops got stolen, right? And we were still quite sort of nascent. We hadn't really got all of our processes in place. So whilst we kind of told everyone, okay, like, you need to encrypt your laptop, obviously, to keep it secure, we didn't have a proper IT system in place. And so there was no actual way of like knowing whether these laptops had been encrypted, or even knowing for sure that people have passwords on these laptops, right? So we were pretty sure that they did. We told everyone to do it, and, et cetera, but we didn't know for sure. And so, there was this big question where it was like, okay, well, we could just sort of shove that under the carpet. No one's going to know. No one will ever notice. Or we could go through a massive amount of pain, which was a huge amount of pain, telling all of our customers, notifying the regulator, everything, that this has happened, right? And we'd always said, like, one of our values is that we're going to act with integrity with our customers and each other, right? We're going to be transparent with them. We're going to tell them, like, when we're going to be very honest. We're going to put our hands up when there's mistakes, even when they're not going to notice necessarily. And we went and did that, right? As an organization, we probably spent 2 weeks worth of like a big part of the company's effort, like going through all the comms, managing it, sending it out. And did that make a big difference to our customers? Probably not. Like, they probably ignored most of it. Most of them probably ignored it, right? But I think the signal it sends to the team, right, that's super important. It's like, okay, no, we take this stuff seriously. We're not just saying these things. We actually care about them. I think the other example of this is, how do you deal with individuals that are doing a really great job but aren't living the values in demonstrable ways? That's always the tough one, right? And sometimes you need to make those kind of tough decisions where you say, well, look, we're going to exit someone, and we're going to be very transparent about it. We're going to tell people, like, look, we're saying goodbye to this person, not because they're not good at their job. They're fantastic at their job, but these are the things that they're doing, and these behaviors don't live by our values, and that's not acceptable. And so it's those kind of like organizational decisions which I think are a big factor in what makes the value stick.
So it is very much rooted in action, I would say. For
sure, 100%. It can't just be about talking about it, right? It has to be rooted in action.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Hiroki. It was enlightening, I would say. And perhaps it's time for us to start taking questions from the audience. While questions get in, one question that I have for you is, so this is a summit for first-time founders, people who just are at the very beginning of their startup journey. Do you see any obvious mistakes, pitfalls, or traps that you can fall into while starting to build your culture? You mentioned a few mistakes that you made, but perhaps some structural thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, if I was starting again, right, I think about this sometimes. Like, what are the things that I would do differently? I mean, there's a long list, but and I think that's fine, right? I mean, especially as first-time founders, you learn a lot from your mistakes. You probably learn a lot more from your mistakes than you learn from the things that go well, right? And so, I think it's important to embrace those mistakes and not shy away from them. And actually, that's how you're going to learn faster. But I think the things that I would do differently. I mean, for one, I would set the values much earlier, right? I would do that, when the company's still sub 10 people. Probably like do it not before you've hired the first. I think it depends on the number of founders. If you're like 2 or 3 founders, maybe you can do it just as a founding team. But ideally, I think I would probably do it when you've got like the first 5 to 10 employees. Those are the people that are going to be defining the culture of your organization, right? And working together with them on the values. I think that I'm a big believer in the importance of values and the impact of values on a culture and a way of shaping cultures. So I think that's one thing that I would do. I think the second thing is, I would try and focus on diversity much earlier on. We didn't really think about diversity, to be honest, until maybe we were like 70, 80 people. And at that point, the later you leave it, the harder it gets, right? Because, what you have to be very conscious of is, like, if you're an engineering team of like 25, 30 people and every single person is a guy, it's quite intimidating, right? For someone else that's not a man to join the team, right? And so I think it's trying to sort of embrace diversity much earlier on in the life cycle of the company. And I think the reason why I think that's super valuable from my perspective is avoiding that kind of trap that we fell into, which is focusing on hiring people that you like as opposed to hiring people that are a good culture fit, and that those two things are very different, right? People you like are probably a good culture fit, but that is a subset of good culture fit, and it's a very dangerous subset to end up in. And so I think that's the other kind of thing that I would do early on. I think that those two are probably the biggest things.
Okay, great. So we have some comments remarking that this sounds like an enormous job. How do you get it as good as you want? How do you make it perfect? Is it possible to make it perfect, or is it like an everyday job that you have to get back on all the time?
Well, I don't know. I'm not so sure it is that big a job, right? I mean, it's something that so I think of if you think, okay, well, what is culture, right? And try and define it. The way I define it, at least in my mind, is that I think of it as like the sum of all of your behaviors, right? All of the company's behaviors on a day-to-day basis, right? So the culture that is there, it exists, whether you like it or not, right? And the every day the culture changes a bit, right, depending on how everyone's behaving. So if you are grumpy one day, the culture of your organization on that day is different from the culture the next day when everyone's happy, right? And so it's something that's evolving and organic and changing all the time, right? So I think the first thing is probably just accepting, like, look, you are going to have a culture, right? There's no such thing as no culture, and that's something that's going to happen whether you like it or not, and it's going to evolve and change, right? It's an organic thing, and so in some senses, it's kind of like maybe like comparing it as an analogy to like a plant that grows from a seed, right? Like if you think about it from a sort of the perspective of physics and biology and the science of like how the germination of the seed turns into a plant, then flowers and becomes a tree, then obviously it sounds like really, really hard, right? You're like, okay, how am I ever going to do that? But the reality is all you need to do is like have the seed that you water and look after and think about and care about, right? And give it the right conditions, and then it grows of its own accord, right? I think that's probably the way to think about it, is like, okay, well, there's actually not that many things that you need to do. It's almost like the things that you don't do, and it's like the key points where you go, okay, do I go left or right here? And and especially when it's tempting to go left because it's easier, or like cut that corner because maybe no one will notice. Having that kind of dedication to say no, this is a decision that matters to our values, and so this is more important than just like the kind of question of the cost benefit analysis of this specific situation. This is about how this is going to impact our culture. And so I think that it's really an important one to kind of identify those moments which are going to be quite defining of your culture in the long term.
I have another one. Perhaps it's a little bit more about your entrepreneurial journey, but when you start building a company, you can have this fear of actually going out there and embracing the role that you have as a leader, as a founder. Did you face that? Did you have imposter syndrome as a founder, or did you just go ahead 100%. And say, okay, let's go and let's do this?
Yeah, no. I mean, I found it a very, very difficult transition. It's funny because at least for me, I never started a business with the view that I wanted to be a leader, right? It didn't really occur to me. I didn't think about it. I just thought, hey, it'd be really cool to build something. Like, let's go and build it and see what happens. And then, you kind of find yourself 2 or 3 years in, and you're like, oh, hang on, here's a whole team, and I'm meant to be leading them. And so, you end up in this situation where, in order to be doing the job well, in order to be effective, you do need to go through that kind of a transition and sort of become a leader, right? Which is different from being a founder. And that was something that I had to work with my coach a lot on, right? I worked with someone that pushed me out of my comfort zone, and really encouraged me to take on that role. And for me, obviously it will be different from everyone, right? Everyone has different reasons why they may struggle with this, right? For me, what I found difficult was like making anything about myself, right? I don't really like attention. I don't really like to be like the center of, or the limelight to be on me. I don't really like any of those things. I kind of prefer to be a bit like in the background, right? And so it was really like accepting that like there is this importance of the founder's story, right? And the founder, almost like thinking of it as like, you're playing a role, right? You're being an actor, right? And that doesn't mean that you have to be inauthentic. It doesn't mean that you have to be like pretending, but almost sort of disassociating a little bit, like your own personal preferences and how you want to be yourself from the kind of the role and the story of the founder, which is really important to the business, right? Still, I find it amazing, like the power of the founder story and the founder journey and the arc, right? Like, it is a really, really important part of building a successful startup, I think. And that's something that it was very difficult for me to accept. But once I started to accept it, then I think the rest of the stuff followed in my situation. But I think it is like probably the most important thing is recognizing like, well, look, what is it that's stopping you from transitioning from that founder role into more of a leadership role? Others maybe don't have this problem. Like, this is just my personal experience. But like, I think it's sort of like, if you do have that problem, like, identifying that it is a problem, one, acknowledging it, and then secondly, like starting to think like, well, what is it that's stopping me? What is it that I don't? What is it about myself that's kind of making me feel uncomfortable, making me hesitant to do this? So everyone will probably have a different journey there, but yeah, definitely one that I struggle with.
Great, thanks. This is super insightful. And so going back a little bit more on topic, we had a few people saying that they had started their journey, and perhaps culture wasn't an entire part of what they were thinking about when they first started. And so now they are faced with some issues. So how do you correct things regarding your culture as you go along? You mentioned that you had to work on your values 3 times. Can you comment on that process, or how do you?
Yeah, I mean, well, I
job?
think I talked about the process of sort of defining the values. So, but I mean, I think that it's an interesting question, right? How do you kind of change a culture? I mean, at the end of the day, I think it kind of just comes back down to that point that you made about it being about action, right? It's like, if I wanted to, I could change the culture in this company quite quickly, right? I would just start hiring people that look very different, hiring people based on, other sets of values. And, that would upset a lot of people in the organization, right? And probably you'd lose a bunch of people, right? And so it's definitely possible. So I think, probably the main thing is, are you willing to bear the cost of it, right? Because if you've built a company and you're in a situation where like you're not happy with the culture, you think you have a problem with it, then almost by definition what you're saying is you have a bunch of people on the team that aren't the right people to be in the business, right? Because the chances that you're going to be able to get them to like change who they are and the way that what they care about and believe it is quite low, right? It's like, I don't think that the way to kind of build great cultures is by trying to change people. I think it's about finding the right people in the first place and saying goodbye to the people that aren't the right people, right? You're not going to get it right every time. Like, everyone makes lots of hiring mistakes. One of the most successful founders I've ever met, he told me he thinks his success rate on hiring is about 60%, right? He's one of the best founders I've ever met, right? So like most of us, if we get to 50%, then we're all doing great, right? So we're going to make mistakes, right? So I think it's about probably, saying, okay, look, this is what we care about. This is the culture we want. This is the values we care about. And then actually starting to make decisions and act based on that, right? That probably is going to upset people. And so saying goodbye to those people, as a result, that's kind of almost, you have to kind of almost see that as a positive consequence of changing the culture. But there's always, I think the important thing to note is there's a lot of costs associated with culture, right? There's a lot of shortcuts that you can take if you're willing to ignore the culture. But I personally believe that like in the long term, it's very difficult to build long-term sustainable, successful, enduring companies if you don't have a great culture.
Definitely agree with that. Some people in the comments were talking about diversity, lack of diversity, either in their countries or companies, or just diversity as a challenge. How did you tackle it? How did you approach that challenge?
I mean, the first thing is like sort of being actually just caring about it, right? And being explicit and care about it. So, I mean, in some ways, it's very, very simple. It's like, okay, if you if you have a sort of a lack of a certain type of individual in your organization, then the only way you're going to solve it is by hiring more of that type of person, right? And so, the first thing is to kind of just acknowledge it and say, okay, well, look, like for example, in our case, it was the most obvious sort of lack of diversity was on gender, right? We were like just in almost the entire company was male, right, in the early stages. And so then it was like just saying, okay, well, look, like we need to hire more women, right? Like that's the only way we're going to do it. And then I think it becomes about, I mean, it's a complex one, and I wouldn't say there's like a silver bullet, but I think that the probably the main thing is patience, right? Because what you'll usually find is that often a lot of the kind of lack of diversity is not just a reflection of your own organization, but is a reflection of the market as a whole. So if you take something like software engineering as an example, right? Like there are just more men that are professional software engineers than women, right? And so like if you just kind of lazily go and hire software engineers, the chances are you're going to hire a lot more men than women. And so you have to have the patience to say, well, look, like we're not just going to hire the first sort of person that comes along. We're going to actually be patient to find the right people that we think are going to be great software engineers that are women, right? And I think that's kind of the key. The key is that patience. I think like longer term, you can start thinking about other aspects as well. Like how do you start to like foster the pipeline, right? So leadership is a really great example, right? If you're struggling to find people of a certain sort of types of, say it's like women or people of color or disability or whatever it is, in leadership roles, a really great way of kind of building that is like taking a longer term view and saying, okay, well, look, we're going to hire people at more junior levels that we're going to train and help develop and build the pipeline for the long term. And so I think there are also longer term like other things that you can do. And then I think the final thing I'd say on diversity is like what I think for me has been really important is not. It's easy to kind of sort of get focused on very specific forms of diversity, right? Men versus women, people of color versus white people, etc. Right? I think that like there's a lot of dimensions that you have to think about, and I think the other thing that's important is it not just being about like the demographic diversity, but also the diversity in like ways of thinking and approaching things, right? Because where I personally think the most of the value of diversity comes from is from having lots of different ways of thinking in the business, right? If you have people with different experiences, different training, different thought patterns, you end up with better answers. You end up with better solutions. And so I think that's the other thing is like being cognizant of like not just focusing on the more concrete dimensions, but also thinking about some of the more meta aspects of diversity as well.
That's very interesting, and more to that, some people are asking, so once you start tackling that challenge of diversity, you start having cultural diversity within your team. How does that affect the organizational culture that was in place? What's the impact?
Yeah, but I think it's like for me, at least, I think it's what's really important is not thinking of culture as a static thing, right? Because I think that like if I go back to like how do I define it? It's that sum of everyone's behaviors every day, right? Every person in the organization. So if you're saying, okay, well, you want your culture to be like the same now when you're 10 people as when you're 100 people and then 1,000 people, I mean, that's kind of scary as a concept, right? You're basically saying like you want an army of robots that all behave in exactly the same way every day, right? That's almost like Big Brother-esque. That's 1984. That is not what I think a great culture looks like, right? I think great cultures are organic. They change, they evolve. Then there's something that kind of is a living thing, an organism that changes over time. And so, I think it's important to embrace that change and say, okay, well, look, like, you know, the culture in a year's time is going to look different from the culture today, but having the confidence to know that that is a culture that's still going to be a positive one. And that's where I think it comes back down to values, right? The values are what kind of set the guardrails of saying, okay, well, look, whilst we're happy for the organization to kind of change its behaviors over time, these are the things that we think are really important, that we want them to be the same throughout the course of the entire sort of life cycle of the culture. And we don't want these specific aspects to change, which is very different from saying like everyone has to behave the same way in every single aspect, every day, right? So I think that's the way I would kind of think about that.
It's very interesting. So it's almost the end of our time together. Perhaps one last question is, so from where you are right now, what would you say are the current cultural challenge for you as a CEO that you have to tackle? What are the things that are in your mind and you feel, okay, we can get to the next step on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there's probably two, right? One, which is probably on everyone's minds, right? Which is, how do you kind of manage your culture? How do you even think about your culture in a world where, all of a sudden everyone's kind of been working separately, remotely for the last 18 months, especially in a situation like for us, like, our office was or in some senses felt like the heart of the culture, right? That was where everyone met. There was like the buzz of the office. And so moving away from that suddenly, and then and also in our case, that we've hired almost twice as many people into the organization post pandemic than we had in the organization before we went into lockdown, right? So more of the organization has never even been in our office than has been in the office, right? And so that's one thing that is definitely a challenge, and especially in a world where we're starting to come out of lockdown. How do we think about the office? How do we think that we'll work together? We don't think it will look the same as the pre-COVID world, and we think that's a positive. But how does culture adapt to that? I think that's one challenge, and I don't think any of us have the answer there yet, right? We don't know. And I think the second thing for us that we've been thinking a lot about is, as the organization scales and as we get more and more diversity into the organization in terms of ways of thinking and ways of working, how do you kind of also guide people in terms of how they operate in a way that kind of helps people to be more effective in their jobs, right? Because while the values are sort of the non-negotiables, there's a lot that sits outside of that. If everyone's kind of working in completely different ways, then it can get quite chaotic, right? So for example, how do we make decisions, right? If you're not clear on that, then that can lead to a lot of confusion. And so one of the things we think about is like operating principles, and what are the kind of guideposts for how we actually work together as a team, which is very interesting, and something we're thinking about at the moment.
Okay, thank you so much, Hiroki, for being here with us today. And
great to chat.
And talking about culture, and I believe everything that you said is something that resonates quite strongly with what we believe at the family, that your culture has to be rooted in action. I like your definition. It's the sum of how people actually behave in the company, and it was very insightful having you talk about the journey and the process to actually build it, and what you still have to do to get there. It's not an easy process, but
it's a never-ending job.
Yeah, it's a really great kind of like a philosophical way to think about organizations, and it makes it super exciting. So thanks again, Hiroki, for being here with us. Next up, we have two keynotes. One with Veronica, the CEO of Didimo Stage, about turning your idea into reality, and the second with the CEO of Getter, Turkey delivery service, is called Writing the Way. So exciting. And thanks again, Hiroki, for being here with us today. It was amazing.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.